back to the Daily Grind. Thanks for checking out the channel. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back pickle biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA
legend Mirko has said that he'll never be on Joe Rogan's podcast. And you know, that would hurt and all, you know, and I'm gonna let Mirko finish and all, you know, but Joe Rogan's podcast is one of the biggest podcasts of all time. You guys realize this is like, I don't know, Odell Beckham Jr. saying, I'll never go on fucking John Madden's podcast. This is like fucking, give me a basketball player, like Ray Allen. This is like Ray Allen saying, I'll never go on Shaq's podcast. It's like, yeah, you know, I'm sure Shaq, you know, wouldn't say no, but I don't think Shaq was penciling you in next week anyway, dog. You know what I'm saying? Like, Joe Rogan's podcast is not just an MMA podcast. It's not just, it's a fucking podcast where he discusses everything. He's a fucking stand-up comedian, a mixed martial arts enthusiast, and also a hunting enthusiast. You learn about everything on Joe Rogan's podcast, whether it's fucking health shit, science shit, hunting shit, mixed martial arts shit, conspiracies. Like, literally, he talks about everything, and his numbers are insane. Just from listening to Joe Rogan's podcast, he's turned other people into fucking stars. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm not even putting it all on Joe Rogan, but I listen to the Joey Diaz podcast. I listen to the Ari Shaffir podcast. I know who Tom Segura is. All of these people I met through the Joe Rogan podcast. When I say I met, I mean I became a fan of. Joe Rogan's podcast does huge numbers, and as I said, it covers many things. So he's got people coming on like the biggest people in the world. Like the Joe Rogan podcast is like the fucking the Letterman of podcasts. It's not just some mom and pop's podcast that needs any guest they can get. Joe Rogan's at the point to where you might have to pay him to get on his podcast. It's some Super Bowl type shit. You know, the Super Bowl used to it was prestigious, you know, for the Super Bowl. They used to have to get the biggest guests, but now it's like, you know, actually I think we're good. You know, if you want the exposure that we bring, the Super Bowl, if you want our exposure, you pay us to perform here now. We're not going to pay you to come perform at our fucking Super Bowl because we know everybody's watching the Super Bowl. That's kind of like what's going on here. So I hear Mirko and all, and essentially the reasoning is because, I guess, I'll just read it to you because I don't want to mix it up. But Joe Rogan, as I said, I mean, he's a comedian for one, and for two, he's talked about conspiracies. For three, he smokes weed on the podcast. Sometimes he drinks on the podcast. So if he says some stuff, half the time it's a joke, half the time he's high, and half the time he's just fucking talking, bro. He's having a conversation. He's not out here reporting. Mirko had $1 million in his suitcase on this time and this date. He's just like, yo, I heard this stuff. Y'all hear about Mirko allegedly having this? Did y'all hear that John Jones, you know, might have had fucking steroids in his cocaine? Yeah, I heard a crazy ass rumor that John Jones fucking steroids was laced with cocaine, and so that's why I heard, you know. So Joe Rogan just speculates on there and has fun. So I hear where Krokop's coming from, which is why I'm gonna read it. But at the same time, I don't think Joe Rogan's gonna be hurting that Mirko Krokop's not gonna come on his podcast. This is what Mirko Krokop had to say. I'll tell you when I'll go on Joe Rogan's podcast, and sorry for the phrase, but you'll see me on Joe Rogan's podcast when my dick grows legs, because Joe Rogan upset me. You know what? He is rude. He's really rude. He started on me so many times. He starts talking on it, and it always begins with something positive, you know, which should be the case, something positive about my career. And then he starts gossiping. First, he spreads stories that I carried millions of dollars in a suitcase, which is physically impossible. And so, you know, he's got reason, and that does happen. But, I mean, that's just being unbiased. What does it look like if Joe Rogan had a podcast and every single person he ever brought up, all he could say is the good things? He couldn't be unbiased. He couldn't give his actual insight. If he hears some crazy rumor, he couldn't bring that up. Nobody would listen to the podcast. And I understand where Krokop's coming from, that old school mentality, and I completely understand that. That's, you know, the mentality that really doesn't appreciate the entertainment and the gossip side of MMA and the stories of MMA. It's just all about the best versus the best. But it is what it is, man. This is 2018, motherfucker. You know what I'm saying? People who, you know, have that Mirko Crocop mentality probably aren't gonna like my channel because I'm gonna report the facts. But if there's some, you know, I'm not just gonna be completely, yeah, Mirko Crocop all did this. You know, let's say, or John Jones. Let's just take Mirko Crocop out of the example. Let's say John Jones, you know, if John Jones tomorrow gets busted with cocaine and steroid in the same car after he got in a wreck and for some reason he took off, you know, everything combined, I'm going to bring up John Jones as one of the greatest fighters of all time. But then am I asshole for saying, yeah, but I also heard, you know, or it's also, he also might be one of the biggest fuck ups in MMA history because of all of the, you know, all of his transgressions. And then, oh, John Jones doesn't, you know what I'm saying? So Joe Rogan is just doing his thug thizzle. Mirko Crocop can be angry, he can be mad at Joe Rogan, and I really don't think Joe Rogan's gonna be too upset about it, especially in 2018, where you know, you don't really need the relationship, especially when you're as big as Joe Rogan, as big as Joe Rogan's podcast. So I've said enough on this video. Let the full-time family know what you think about this stuff in the comments. I'm out.
Da 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 da. It's the motherfucking DO double G.